No, it's not a battle, and that's one of the points we're working on right now. No, it's not a battle.
There will be no ceasefire in Ukraine to hold a referendum because that prolongs the war. Negotiations will last at least a few more weeks. Vladimir Putin wants the war to end. Moreover, the Russian dictator supposedly wants Ukraine to prosper, and his involvement in Ukraine's post-war recovery could be in supplying Ukraine with cheap energy resources. These are the statements that American President Donald Trump made at the final press conference after meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He also assured that he is ready to come to Ukraine and address the parliament if it helps to reach a peace agreement. He concluded that if a peace agreement can't be reached, they will have to continue fighting and dying. The issue of security guarantees is still unresolved. As Trump said, the most difficult issues still remain territorial ones and the issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And overall, as always, we remained at the same stage with all issues being 90–95% resolved. Basically, that figure was mentioned before as well, but don't jump to conclusions because something interesting was actually said at this press conference. So I suggest we go through it step by step. My name is Pechiy. Let's analyze this press conference of Trump and Zelensky together, and before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link is in this video's description. There I publish the main news almost in real time as it comes in.
To be continued. To be continued. To be continued.
To be continued. Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. As a result of the negotiations, the talks between Zelensky and Trump lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and then for about another hour, Trump and Zelensky spoke with European leaders. And here Alexander Stubb, who is the president of Finland and by the way a close friend of Donald Trump, stated that the negotiations were indeed substantive, very constructive, and clearly more positive than negative. There's some progress, but as I said, nothing was expected or resolved today. So, on all points, they agreed to continue negotiating further. But there are certain developments, for example, the creation of working groups, which will now include Pechiy. This is the Secretary of Defense of the United States. I stress he is the Secretary of Defense, not Secretary of War, because Congress never approved renaming it the Department of War in the military budget. That's an interesting remark, but what's also interesting is that now Trump has a call with Putin coming up. And right at the beginning of the press conference, Trump announced that the parties had made significant progress in the negotiations, but these negotiations are not finished yet. He says, "We are close to a solution, but this is not the end yet. We've discussed all the topics." In the next few weeks, as he says while addressing Zelensky, we will be talking a lot, and there will definitely be some very heated discussions. Trump stated that, in his opinion, a peace agreement on Ukraine is very close, and he described one of the two very contentious issues that remain unresolved. He refused to name the exact percentage of the agreed terms, but said it could be around 95. Trump acknowledged that the fate of the eastern Donbas region, which Russia has demanded Ukraine to give up, remains an unresolved issue. But nevertheless, he is confident that we are now getting closer and closer to reaching a peace agreement. Zelensky briefly thanked Donald Trump's entire team, mentioned the 20 points of the peace plan, said that according to him, 90 issues were discussed, the guarantees are almost agreed upon, and the plan for Ukraine's prosperity and recovery is nearly finalized. There was a conversation with European leaders, and almost an hour after that, the European leaders and Zelensky will come to Trump with the whole team in January. This is an interesting point. And Trump confirmed a bit later that yes, such a meeting between the Europeans, Zelensky and Trump will indeed take place in Washington next month. Trump added that Ukraine is very important for Europe and the United States, but still more so for Europe. As for security guarantees, Trump said that progress has been made, but this can't be resolved in a single day. Europe will take on most of the security guarantees because, after all, it's Europe, but the United States will also provide security guarantees, although it's not yet clear what kind. But here comes a very interesting point, which I actually pointed out today in my Telegram channel Pechiy News. So here it's worth looking at the composition of the American delegation, because today it included, of course, Donald Trump, Secretary of State Mark Rubio, and Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff. Next, the head of the Joint Committee, Chief of Staff Dan Kane, the head of the White House staff Susie Wiles, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Homeland Security Stephen Miller, and then Jared Kushner. Of course, next is Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Federal Procurement Commissioner Josh Greenbaum. Here, I immediately singled out 4 people for myself. Pete Hegseth, Dan Kane, the head of the Joint Committee and Chief of Staff, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Homeland Security Miller, and Greenbaum. So, it can be emphasized that the delegation includes those people who are actually working on finalizing the security guarantees, and specifically that the delegation does not include Vice President J.D. Vance, who caused a scandal on February 28 in the Oval Office. And his associate, General Dan Driscoll, is also not present, who I remind you came to Kyiv and presented Ukraine with a 28-point peace plan that was actually written by the Russians. So these two are not part of the negotiating team. Later, when Trump was asked about the working groups and their members, he said Pete Hegseth and his team would participate, but John David Vance and Driscoll would not be included. An interesting question was raised about Russia helping to rebuild Ukraine since Russia destroyed our country. So then Trump gave a very lengthy answer to this question, and I was really surprised at how much Trump is still influenced by the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Before meeting Zelensky, he spoke with Putin, then almost quoted Trump word for word. Russia will help rebuild Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine to prosper. It sounds strange, but Putin wants Ukraine to thrive, and he was so kind that he promised to supply Ukraine with cheap energy resources. This will be Russia's role in rebuilding Ukraine. All this nonsense today comes from Putin. Vend is trading on the strengthening of gas, with lovingly introducing the controller, regional company Blagunosheni is advancing the formula. The council turned their attention to Ukraine for... The problem is that Groboag to give energy to Ukraine. He damn stole this station from us, but Trump forgets that, and then what? As for the free economic zone in Donbas, Trump said that they almost reached an agreement here, but it will still be discussed. This issue hasn't been fully resolved. Zelensky first tried to avoid the question and talked about how the negotiations went, saying it's a complicated issue, but then he still said, listen, all questions about the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbas, the creation of a demilitarized free zone there, and so on, are all matters for the Ukrainian people, and Ukraine must comply with the law and respect the opinion of Ukrainians. This territory doesn't belong to just Volodymyr Zelensky, but to all Ukrainians. But he says there is a tool, it's a referendum. But without a referendum, no one will give up Donbas, so only the people should decide this issue. So his position is firm, but he has settled on it and says this is the only way to address the issue of Donbas. Trump made a statement here, and it was interesting because Trump said that the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions is simply what Moscow is demanding. But this still needs to be discussed. That is, he himself is not insisting on it. But actually then Trump started to backtrack, and when he was asked which issues remain unresolved, he said, well, territorial ones. And that's when Trump faltered and stated that in the coming months, new Ukrainians could be captured. That's why it would be better to reach a peace agreement as soon as possible, otherwise the Russians will capture all of Ukraine. Remember, I mentioned in previous episodes when Putin dressed up in military uniform? The day before, during his briefing, he learned that Hulyai-Pol in Zaporizhzhia and Mirnohrad in Donetsk had been captured by the Russians. He said, yes, listen, we're no longer interested in Ukraine withdrawing troops from Donetsk. We'll capture everything anyway. I said it was a show for an audience of one, Donald Trump, so he'd say, wow, look at the Russians. In a few more months, they'll capture all of Ukraine. That's why pressuring Zelensky to sign a peace agreement quickly would be better. It worked. Unfortunately, this show kept working. Trump says Russia and Ukraine want peace, but Russia will keep advancing on the front. He says, "I get along very well with Putin, so we can make a deal again." He repeated several times that he and Putin are almost best friends. Trump: "What's next? Anything interesting?" Trump said that he is ready to come to Ukraine and address the parliament to push for a peaceful people's agreement. They will quote him on this: "You know, I have no problem with going to Ukraine, but we are not expecting it. I would like to finalize the deal and I don't necessarily have to go there, but I offered to speak before their Ukrainian parliament. And, will that help? I don't know if it will help, I think it probably will, but I don't even know if it will be received positively." To which Zelensky says, "Yes, of course, please come to Ukraine." It's interesting that, yes, Trump kind of admitted that he's actually ready to come to Ukraine and thus promote a peace agreement. Well, let's see. Now, here's a tricky moment. Trump says that there won't be a ceasefire because the war could resume. That's what Vladimir Putin told him. He spoke with Putin, and Putin said no, there should be no temporary ceasefire until a peace agreement is reached, because then there's a risk of the war resuming. That makes sense in theory, but Trump says Putin told him there won't be a ceasefire for a referendum. On the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Trump again proved he's out of touch with the situation. So he says Putin told him that 5,000 people are working at the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, and Putin wants to open it as soon as possible. He wants it to start working faster so electricity can flow freely. That's why the war must end. And Putin is so kind that he will launch the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but Trump in fact didn't say under whose control this plant will be. Next, Pete Hegseth will join the working group and it will work with the Russians. He also says it's great that we Americans work separately with Ukrainians than with Russians and so on. We need to somehow bring it all together already. He repeated that negotiations would continue for several more weeks, warning things could go badly and the war could drag on. What else did Trump mention about talking with Putin? Trump announced a meeting between three people: Zelensky, Putin, and Trump. He says that Putin and I discussed the mystification of Russia. He says, like, the Democrats made all this up. He says it's all those damn Democrats. They made up that Russia is bad. They made up that we can't get along. So now, as Trump says, it's time to establish trade with Russia, because it's a large territory. Well, how are we supposed to make money from this? Trump claims Hillary Clinton created the idea that Russia is bad, making cooperation with Russia harder. And now everything will be fine. And again, he repeated that he knows Putin very well, and he says that we will trade with the Russians. But here's another interesting point. Attention. Trump thanked Volodymyr Zelensky for the first time, and not the other way around. Trump was the one thanking Zelensky. He recalled how the United States, led by Joe Biden, spent money on Ukraine. Today he mentioned $300 billion. But he says now there is a deal on minerals that was made between Ukraine and the United States. And Trump is grateful to Zelensky for this deal. He told Zelensky he was grateful for his kindness in making the deal and thanked the Ukrainian president. This is what happens when Trump is thanked several times. He suddenly starts being grateful himself. So in conclusion, I want to add that, in my opinion, the main result of this meeting is that Zelensky managed to calmly get through these negotiations without quarreling with Trump and without giving up Ukraine's key interests. So, as you can see, we saw that at the press conference, Trump wasn't irritated at all. He was in a normal mood. And this shows that, indeed, he wasn't really opposed to what Zelensky was saying. And Zelensky also didn't look particularly crushed. There was some fatigue, but Trump still wasn't attacking Zelensky. At the same time, Zelensky clearly voiced the Ukrainian position that no one is going to give up Donbas and no one wants to make any major concessions to Putin. Trump simply responded to this by saying, well, kind of. We'll continue working with a few more weeks of substantive negotiations in working groups and so on. That's why, friends, let's keep watching. I think that in the near future, more details will emerge. At the end, I want to add for you, a short video. Just look at the expression on Volodymyr Zelensky's face at the moment when he was saying the very quote that I mentioned to you. About how supposedly Putin wants to see Ukraine succeed and is ready to invest in Ukraine's prosperity. This is exactly how Volodymyr Zelensky reacted to that phrase from Donald Trump. Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed.
It sounds a bit strange, but I explained to the President Putin.
So I'll leave it at that, friends. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. If you found this episode useful or interesting and want to support our work, you can do so with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video it says, support the Alexei Pechiy channel. Choose any format that's convenient. Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, PayPal, bank details, or crypto wallets. Pick whatever works best for you. I appreciate your support. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.